The American Civil War. It's a cornerstone in the identity and history of the United States of America. The war and the events surrounding it helped shape the country into what it is today, and the cultural impact the war had on the American conscience and what it meant to truly be a united state cannot be understated. Even today, the war is still widely discussed, debated, and brought up in media, with there being hundreds of documentaries, TV shows, and movies dedicated to the American Civil War. But there is only one film I always remember when thinking about media related to the American Civil War, and that film is Gettysburg. To me, Gettysburg has been able to carve itself out from amongst the other titanic Civil War films like Gone with the Wind, Glory, and A Birth of a Nation. It's expertly crafted and always left a stark impression on me after viewing it. Gettysburg is a ginormous 4.5-hour epic, giving a detailed, fair, and quite emotional depiction of the Battle of Gettysburg.
You must look to your division.
General Lee, I have no division.
From showing us the highest of generals to the lowest of foot soldiers, it's a remarkable and unique experience. It's also a downright miracle that the film was made. The fact that it was made is a testament to director Ron Maxwell's undying vision to try and present the most authentic and accurate depiction of the Battle of Gettysburg as he could. Even with the natural limitations of film, the film does an excellent job at not only being a film, but also recreating the history and bringing it to light in a spectacular fashion. While I find the actual history behind the Battle of Gettysburg very interesting, I also found that the production behind the film is surprisingly interesting as well. With the film having an insane production behind it, just like any of the great epics, it won't shock you to know that the level of work and dedication that went into this film is nothing short of incredible. The story of the Battle of Gettysburg has been told many times, but the production behind Gettysburg hasn't, and I would like to illuminate this fascinating story of one man's vision to recreate the most important battle in the American Civil War. Our story starts with a man called Michael Scherer and his book The Killer Angels, which tells the story of the Battle of Gettysburg broken up into 3 days. The book was published in 1974 and went on to become extremely popular, with it winning the Pulitzer Prize in 1975. A small-time director called Ron Maxwell, often just referred to as Ron Maxwell, was looking for his next project when he happened to read The Killer Angels. He was so enthralled by the book, he wanted to acquire the film rights, with the intention of adapting the book into a film about the Battle of Gettysburg. Ron Maxwell would later acquire the rights to make a movie adaptation of the book in 1981. He got to know Michael Cera personally, and he even hired Michael to write the screenplay for the film, but unfortunately for Maxwell, Michael died in 1988, leaving Maxwell to finish up the almost 400-page long screenplay. To gain inspiration for the screenplay, Maxwell would walk the fields of Gettysburg to get a feeling and the spirit of the place, then inject that into his screenplay. He would eventually complete the screenplay, and now all he had to do was pitch it to a studio and hopefully get funding for his project to get it off the ground. However, this wouldn't go to plan for Maxwell, as finding a studio to produce the film was harder than he thought it would be, but Maxwell persevered, as he was determined to make the film, and he was finally able to convince Polygram Pictures to produce the film. Disaster would strike for Maxwell, however, as Polygram Pictures would soon go bankrupt, and it left Maxwell without anybody to produce the movie and effectively left the project dead in the water. But Maxwell wouldn't give up so easily, and he would spend 7 years trying to find a studio or person that would be interested in producing his epic tale of the Battle of Gettysburg. During this time, Maxwell had to sell his house in order to keep the rights to adapt The Killer Angels. Maxwell was undeterred by this and kept going to meet with studio executives and constantly got rejected from every major studio in America, with them always citing how risky of an investment it would be for such a massive epic. They also cited the lack of audience interest in historical epics at the time. Other historical epics like Heaven's Gate from 1980 and Revolution from 1985 were brutally mauled in the box office, with them being massive box office bombs, and The Bounty from 1984 was also a box office flop, but not to the same degree as the previous two. With these constant rejections, Maxwell had to rethink his strategy. Instead of making a film about the Battle of Gettysburg, he could instead make a miniseries about the battle. A miniseries would be seen as less of a risk due to a miniseries being able to run for longer on a TV network and generate more revenue over time, rather than banking on it being a one-time box office hit. Maxwell was hesitant to turn his project into a television series due to him finding that TV series about historical events often trivialized the event they were trying to portray rather than doing the historical subject matter justice. Notable examples similar to Gettysburg being The Blue and Grey from 1982 and North and South from 1985. Maxwell eventually relented and sought out a TV network that would be willing to produce his epic version of the Battle of Gettysburg, but for smaller screens this time. After a couple of rejections for similar reasons to why major studios had passed on it, he decided he needed help. and teamed up with well-known documentarian Ken Burns, who had just finished his PBS documentary called The Civil War in 1990. Later, in 1991, the two attended an award show for American producers and met up with Ted Turner, who ran the TNT network. Turner had a keen interest in the American Civil War and was quite the Civil War buff. The pair managed to convince Turner to produce the project, with the idea that the project would be made for Turner's TNT television network. While Maxwell and Burns were able to convince Turner himself, everybody around Turner at the time told him it was a terrible idea and he shouldn't fund it, due to many reasons I have previously stated, such as the cost of making such a miniseries and the lack of profits to be made off of it. Turner was undeterred by the people around him and saw Maxwell's vision to bring the Battle of Gettysburg to life. It helped a lot that Turner himself was interested in the Civil War, as without him bankrolling the project, it most likely would have never been made. To thank Ted Turner for his cooperation in producing the miniseries, Maxwell gave him a cameo during Pickett's Charge, with Turner portraying Confederate Colonel Waller T. Patton, who was the great uncle of the famous George S. Patton from World War II. Turner had a custom uniform made for himself, and Maxwell also gave a cameo to Ken Burns, who appears as one of General Hancock's aides. Now with funding secured and pre-production starting, Maxwell needed a cast of actors and stars, a place to film, and an army to film with. While Maxwell had the perfect idea for the latter two, the former was slightly more of a challenge. Originally, when Maxwell was pitching the project to film studios, he envisioned Robert Duvall as Robert E. Lee. Duvall is actually distantly related to Robert E. Lee on his mother's side. While Duvall was initially interested, he eventually dropped out after the project went through production hell. Once Maxwell had secured the funding, he approached Duvall again, but Duvall once again turned it down. Ironically, Duvall would actually play Robert E. Lee in Ron Maxwell's later film called Gods and Generals, which is a prequel to Gettysburg. After Duvall had turned down the role again, the role of Robert E. Lee would be offered to Albert Finney and George C. Scott, who both turned it down. Finally, offering it to Martin Sheen, while initially hesitant, he did eventually accept the role. Other stars to join the production were Tom Berenger as Lieutenant General Longstreet, Jeff Daniels as Colonel Chamberlain, Stephen Lang as Major General Pickett, Sam Elliott as Brigadier General Buford, and Richard Jordan as Brigadier General Armistead. Richard Jordan gives a powerful performance as Armistead.
General Armistead sends his regrets. Will you tell him? Oh, very sorry. I am.
Even with his health rapidly declining during production, and would sadly pass away before the film released. Now that Maxwell had his cast, he needed locations to shoot the miniseries, and an army to represent both sides. Maxwell would decide to shoot Gettysburg in Pennsylvania, in and around Adams County. This was an ideal place for Maxwell to shoot, because it was the county where the actual battle took place. There was also a lot of buildings from that time period that were still well preserved from the 19th century, often being in very authentic and accurate states, to the point where the production team had to do little set dressing to get it looking in order with the time period. For instance, the set of houses that Chamberlain and his men march through are just a small group of preserved 19th century farmhouses that the production team found. Another similar location was a well-preserved farmhouse that was found and set up to be the Confederates' medical station. While these were all great, Maxwell also wanted to shoot on the real locations the battle took place at, with such locations as Little Round Top, Devil's Den, Seminary Ridge, and the actual field that Pickett's Charge took place on. These were his main priorities, but it wouldn't be as easy as going to the landowner and asking them if they could film there. Unlike the previous locations I have mentioned, the real locations where the battle took place are part of the Gettysburg National Military Park and is run by the National Park Service. The National Park Service had banned reenactments of the Battle of Gettysburg on the park after the American Civil War centennial in the 1960s. This was done in order to protect the park from overuse and the destruction of its natural and preserved landscape. That's one of the main reasons why Maxwell wanted to shoot there. Due to its preserved state, it was the perfect place to shoot the film and is basically untouched by modern times and looks extremely similar to how it looked on the days of the actual battle. Apart from some of the modern infrastructure and monuments dedicated to the men who fought and died there, it was practically the same. Maxwell had to convince the National Park Service that the miniseries he was trying to make would be authentic and respectful to the battle and the history surrounding it, along with also convincing them that he and his production crew would be respectful to the land and not mistreat it. The National Park Service would read over the script to see if Maxwell was being authentic and respectful to the history. After reading over it and having much discussion whether to let him film there or not, they eventually did decide to grant him permission to film in the national park, but this came with some conditions. Those conditions were the production were only able to film in certain portions of the real locations, they had to work in and around visitor hours, and they were only allowed to film for one day on the field of Pickett's Charge. There were other minor conditions as well, but the ones I've just mentioned were some of the main ones. Regardless of all those conditions, it was a huge win for Maxwell and showed that he was clearly trying to be authentic and respectful to the history as possible, as this was the first time a film or television series was granted permission to film directly on the battlefield of the national park with the intention of recreating the battle. While they were allowed to film on the national park, the production crew decided to film all of the battle sequences on private properties and farms in the surrounding areas of the national park. Buford's cavalry scenes were filmed 8 miles away from the real location due to the production team needing a large open field away from roads and traffic in order to be able to recreate Chambersburg's pike. The same goes for the battle sequence at Little Round Top. That was filmed 4 miles away from the real location. The production team managed to find a hill that was very similar to the actual Little Round Top, all the way down to the same trees, stones, and even the incline of the hill. The reason that the production decided to film some of it off of the national park was because of a couple of reasons. Firstly, on private property, the production team had greater freedom to alter the landscape, chopping down trees, moving rocks, and the freedom to use as many explosives as they wanted. They did this at locations like the place they used to represent Little Round Top and the location they used to represent the bloody angle at Pickett's Charge. The production crew even went as far as building a flat for Schmucker's Hall for the Seminary Ridge scenes. The flat was half the size of the original building, but it was shot prospectively so it just looks as big as the real building. They did use the real Schmucker's Hall for a couple of Buford scenes, but they had to shoot the back of the building and angle the camera in a certain way so you couldn't see the modern buildings on either side. The production crew also built stone walls and 19th century fence lines to better portray the defenses and look of the non-national park locations. They even went as far as putting dirt all over the Emmitsburg Road to make it look like an old dirt road from the time and to cover up the tarmac that was there in the modern day. Secondly, the Gettysburg National Park is covered in monuments dedicated to the soldiers and commanders. Sometimes they were able to cover up these monuments with outhouses and other clever techniques, but some areas of the national park, like Little Round Top, just had too many monuments to the point where it was unfilmable, because if they had filmed there, they would have ended up getting one of the monuments in the shot by accident. In addition to the monuments, the national park also had a massive observation tower overlooking the battlefield. This made it extremely hard to film some of the areas without getting it in the frame, just due to the size of the tower and how it overlooked the park. Even with some of the limitations caused by the battlefield being made into a national park, the added benefit of it being made into a national park was the park's infrastructure made it easier to get to some of the locations, especially for a large film crew with hundreds of extras and reenactors. I think Maxwell and the production team did an excellent job portraying the main locations of the battle with the non-authentic locations, perfectly blending real locations with non-real locations. It does help that most of them were only a couple of miles away from each other. A good example of this blend of locations is with Pickett's Charge. The start of Pickett's Charge was filmed on the actual location of Pickett's Charge, but because of the reasons I listed earlier, they filmed the actual engagement between the Confederate and Union troops on private farmland. Then it was seamlessly edited together, and as a viewer, you never really bat an eye at the slight change of geography. The start of Pickett's Charge was also when the production had the most extras on set, roughly around 3,000 to 5,000 extras, an impressive number considering the production had only been using a couple hundred extras for other scenes. Reenactors and Civil War enthusiasts from all around the United States and even some other countries came down to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania to volunteer their time for free and to take part in the recreation of Pickett's Charge. Many left their families at home to travel down alone or with a group of friends, giving up their vacation time to be able to make it there. It was the biggest event that would take place during filming, with Maxwell getting up early in the morning to direct all the positions for nearly all of the 3,000 to 5,000 extras, getting them as close as possible to the original formations, ready to faithfully recreate the fateful charge. Maxwell also had around 40 real Civil War era cannons lined up, ready to recreate the epic cannon barrage before the charge took place. Many of the reenactors and cannon crews themselves had never seen or heard that many cannons going off at once before. It was a shock to them and everyone in the crew just how loud it was, and they weren't even using full charges. Due to safety concerns about filming right next to firing cannons, the production team had to use a very early version of a drone that was a mini remote-controlled helicopter to capture much of the footage. It was also used to film a couple of the scenes for Pickett's Charge. The reason Gettysburg needed all of those extras and cannons was because the film was made in the early 90s, and CGI as a tool for movies was still in its infancy. Back then, movies still needed to be done mostly practical. This presented a huge challenge for production teams trying to make big war epics like Gettysburg. These days, it would mostly be done with a couple of extras filled in by CGI, but back then, there was no such thing. Questions might stop popping up like, where do we find all the extras to represent the soldiers? Where are we going to find all of the period accurate arms and uniforms to equip the extras? And how much money is this going to cost us? Other productions like Waterloo and the 1962 version of the 300 Spartans answered these questions by getting the backing of governments and their armies, but Maxwell had a different idea in mind. Maxwell's different idea was instead of getting a government's backing, he would get the backing of the reenactors. Maxwell knew he was going to use reenactors as they would be perfect. Reenactors were historians and people just interested in the American Civil War who would be more than happy to bring their own musket, uniform, and kit, along with offering their time, energy, and expertise for free. They did this because they deeply cared about the Civil War and its history, with many of their ancestors having fought and died during the war. The reenactment culture was always strong in America, and especially the American Civil War reenactments. Reenactors were the perfect answer to all of the questions about extras, uniforms, arms, and the cost of hiring this many people. Maxwell knew this and didn't hesitate to contact their organizations, asking if they would be interested in participating. Along with contacting many organizations, simple word of mouth spread throughout the community of reenactors that a movie company was looking for reenactors to be part of a Gettysburg miniseries, and many people decided they would sign up to do it. A production team got in contact with an organization known as Napoleonic Tactics to organize all of the reenactors. There was only one slight problem with Napoleonic Tactics. They supposedly had a disconnect between themselves and the reenactors, leading to hardly any reenactors turning up when filming actually began. This set the production back and led to the production team having to fire Napoleonic Tactics and bring on Michael Krauss to organize the Union troops while George Hefner would organize the Confederate troops. Michael Krauss also wanted to bring on Brian Pohanka as a historical advisor. Brian would work with the costume team and the production design team to ensure everything was as accurate as possible. Maxwell would give Brian a small cameo as Brigadier General Webb. These guys were in charge of organizing the reenactors, and things started moving smoothly again. The production team also managed to whittle down the reenactors to find a core group of reenactors that would be used for most, if not all, of the battle sequences, and they would be able to play both Union and Confederate soldiers. This core group of reenactors would be paid for their time, and they would total to around 100 to 200 at a time. Most of them lived in a tent city which was located in the surrounding fields by Gettysburg, just like how the real soldiers would have lived in the 19th century. Most of the reenactors didn't mind this, as it was just like many of the reenactments they had been to. Life in the tent city was just like life in a reenactment as well. Although the reenactors lived in a tent city, they were well fed and had access to showers and bathrooms. Not all of the reenactors lived in the tent city. Some of them lived in more comfortable apartments rented out by the production. Some of the reenactors lived there for a couple of weeks, while others lived there longer. The reenactors were a major help to the production, and without them the film would have never been made. Just look at all of the different reenactment units in the credits of the film. The reenactors were extremely easy to work with, and they were often better than the real actors because they knew their stuff more than them. If anything was not to their liking in terms of accuracy to the history, they would not do it. But if things were right, they only needed to be told once to do something, and they would know exactly how to do it. Most, if not all of them, were immensely passionate people, and they were treated with respect by the film crew. Oftentimes, if the costume department didn't have something on hand, they could easily go up to a reenactor and ask if they could borrow it for a scene.
Yeah, well, reenactors are the best prop men you're going to find because they have everything sitting there waiting to go. And they're more than happy to have it on screen. All you have to do is ask.
They were always happy to give up their time and expertise while on and off set. While the reenactors brought most of their own kit, there were some normal extras, stuntmen, and Civil War enthusiasts that require uniforms and kit to be supplied to them. Because of this, the costume department had to make a number of costumes, which they described not as costumes, but authentically replicated clothing. Everything down to the smallest button was made to be authentic and accurate. The reenactors would assist in dressing them properly so they wouldn't stand out as not accurate or authentic to the Civil War. Some people have criticized some of the uniforms for being too clean, but I personally disagree with that criticism. If you look at a lot of the uniforms, they are often covered in mud and blood. Not all of them are, but a good majority are. Another thing that was criticized was the beards. Many people have criticized the beards in the film, and while some of the beards are quite bad, like Major General Stewart's, others, like Robert E. Lee's, are fine. Apparently the budget didn't allow for the best beard makeup, so that's why some are weaker than others. Overall, it's very minor and something that doesn't overly affect the film. Gettysburg had one troubled development history, with it going from a film to a miniseries, then back to a film, after Ted Turner saw the footage. Turner realized that this was something special, and that deserved a theatrical presentation. At any point it could have been easily scrapped or cancelled, but Maxwell's dedication for almost 15 years to try and make the film is admirable, along with all of the countless people who helped bring his vision to life. Gettysburg is a prime example of how cinema and history can work perfectly together to produce excellent results, if done right. Most of the time it isn't, and we get some pretty atrocious productions. The dedication that Maxwell and his team put into Gettysburg shows. There was also countless of on-set historians helping to correct and enlighten the crew on little details, and for the people who know their stuff and have a keen eye can appreciate it. It's shocking that no one was seriously injured or killed while filming Gettysburg, but it goes to show how they treated the production. Gettysburg may be extremely long, but it's well worth the watch. It's a unique experience from its great cinematography to its wonderful epic score. The film is an epic deserving of the title, with it having an equally epic and insane production history. If you haven't seen the film, I highly recommend it, especially if you're into war films or epics. I also like to thank the channel Real History for their amazing and eye-opening video on the making of Gettysburg. It helped in the research, and if you want to hear more personal accounts from people who were actually on the set, I recommend watching it. I'll leave a link for it in the description.